Are you spending every single weekend on your knees pulling the same weeds you already pulled last week? And are you tired of spending money on chemical weed killers, not even knowing for sure if they're safe for your soil, your pets, or the kids playing barefoot in your yard? If either of those hit close to home, stay with me, because there's a far easier fix than another bottle of spray or another afternoon spent weeding. It comes down to what you plant. Fill your garden with the right greenery, and those plants start doing the weed fighting for you. They block the sunlight weeds need to sprout, they crowd out the space weeds would otherwise take over, and they turn bare, weed-prone soil into a thick, living cover that leaves weeds almost nowhere to grow. Today I'm sharing 7 plants that experienced gardeners rely on for exactly this. Each one suppresses weeds in its own way, and each one brings something extra to your garden too, whether that's fragrance, color, texture, or just being wonderfully low maintenance once it's settled in. I'll walk you through how each one works, its best growing conditions, a planting tip, and a mistake to avoid. Stick around for all 7, because I think at least one of them is exactly what a stubborn corner of your yard has been waiting for. Let's get into it, starting with plant number 1, lavender. Let's start with lavender. Why gardeners love it. Gardeners love lavender for so many reasons, but the fragrance is usually what wins people over first. That soft, calming scent drifting across the yard on a warm afternoon is hard to beat, and it's one of those plants that makes a garden feel intentional and cared for, almost like a little retreat you've built for yourself. Lavender has been grown for centuries, not just for its beauty, but for its many practical uses, from sachets and soaps to dried arrangements that hold their scent for months. There's a reason it's remained a garden favorite across so many generations and so many different climates. Beyond the smell, lavender has a wonderfully tidy, mounded growth habit that fills in space nicely along borders, pathways, and sunny beds. It has a way of softening hard edges, like the border along a walkway or the base of a fence, while still looking neat and deliberate rather than wild or overgrown. How it naturally suppresses weeds. As lavender matures, it forms a dense, bushy structure with tightly packed stems and narrow, silvery green leaves. That density means less bare soil is exposed to sunlight, and since most weed seeds need light to germinate, you end up with far fewer weeds getting a foothold underneath and around the plant. It's not an impenetrable barrier, but it does create a natural discouragement simply by taking up space, shading the ground beneath it, and leaving weeds with very little room to establish themselves. Best growing conditions. Lavender does best in full sun, with at least 6 hours of direct light a day, and it strongly prefers soil that drains well. This is a plant that would honestly rather be a little too dry than sitting in soggy ground, so if you have heavy clay soil, working in some sand, grit, or fine gravel before planting will make a noticeable difference in how well it performs. Lavender also tends to prefer soil on the slightly alkaline side, so if your soil is naturally acidic, a light application of garden lime every year or two can help it thrive. It's also worth noting that lavender is quite forgiving of poor or average soil, which makes it a wonderful choice for the parts of your yard where richer soil isn't really an option. It's also worth knowing that not all lavender is the same, and choosing the right type for your climate can make a real difference in how well it performs as a weed suppressor. English lavender tends to handle colder winters better, making it a solid choice for northern gardens, while French and Spanish lavender varieties often prefer the milder, drier conditions found in warmer regions. If you're not sure which type suits your area, a quick chat with staff at a local nursery can save you a fair bit of trial and error, since a lavender plant that's struggling to survive the winter certainly won't be filling in and blocking weeds the way a happy, thriving one will. Benefits beyond weed control. Beyond weed suppression, lavender attracts bees, butterflies, and other pollinators, which is always a welcome bonus if you're growing vegetables or fruit nearby. It tolerates drought remarkably well once established, meaning fewer worries during a dry summer stretch, and it can be harvested for sachets, dried bouquets, or even used in cooking, particularly in baked goods and herbal teas. Many gardeners also find that the strong scent helps deter certain pests, like deer and rabbits, from wandering too close to nearby plants. Practical planting tip. Space your lavender plants a little closer together than the tag suggests, maybe 2/3 of the recommended spacing, so they fill in and knit together faster. This speeds up that weed-blocking canopy effect considerably, sometimes cutting the fill-in time by a full season. Another helpful tip is to prune your lavender lightly after its first bloom each summer. This encourages bushier, denser growth the following year, which only improves its ability to shade out weeds over time. Common mistake to avoid. A common mistake to avoid is overwatering, especially in the first year. Lavender roots are prone to rot in soil that stays wet, so it's better to underwater slightly than to be overly generous, particularly in clay-heavy gardens or in regions with humid summers. Another mistake worth mentioning is planting lavender too close to sprinkler heads or in a bed that gets frequent shallow watering meant for thirstier plants nearby. Lavender is much happier with occasional, deep watering rather than frequent light sprinkling. Once your lavender is settled in and thriving, you might be looking for something a little lower to the ground to fill in the gaps around it and along the front edge of your beds, and that brings us naturally to our next plant, Sweet Alyssum. Plant 2, Sweet Alyssum. Now let's talk about Sweet Alyssum. Why gardeners love it. Sweet Alyssum is one of those plants that quietly does a lot of work without asking for much in return. Gardeners love it because it's inexpensive, blooms constantly through the growing season, often from late spring right up until the first frost, and has this soft, cloud-like appearance with tiny white, pink, or purple flowers that seem to spill over everything they touch. It has a gentle, honey-like fragrance too, which is a lovely bonus, especially when it's planted somewhere you'll walk past often, like along a front path or near a patio. How it naturally suppresses weeds. The way Sweet Alyssum suppresses weeds is fairly simple, but genuinely effective. It grows low and spreads quickly, forming a thick mat of foliage and flowers that covers the soil surface within just a few weeks of planting. That living carpet blocks sunlight from reaching the ground, which means weed seeds sitting dormant in the soil have a much harder time sprouting and getting established. Because it fills in so fast, it's especially useful for covering bare patches between larger, slower-growing plants, or along the edges of garden beds where soil might otherwise sit exposed for a season or two while other plants mature. Best growing conditions. Sweet Alyssum grows best in full sun to partial shade, and it isn't picky about soil as long as drainage is reasonable, making it a forgiving choice for gardeners who are still learning what their particular yard likes and dislikes. It's a wonderful companion plant, often used near vegetable gardens because it attracts beneficial pollinators and even helps draw in insects that prey on common garden pests like aphids. Some gardeners plant it specifically among their vegetables for this reason alone, weed suppression aside. Benefits beyond weed control. Beyond weed control, Sweet Alyssum adds non-stop color for months at a time, works beautifully as a border plant along walkways, and can even be tucked into containers and hanging baskets where it will spill gracefully over the edges. It's also a fairly quick plant to establish from seed, which makes it an economical choice if you're trying to fill a large area without spending too much on nursery starts. Practical planting tip. Scatter seeds or set out small starts fairly close together, right from the beginning, since Alyssum's weed-blocking power really comes from that dense, quick-filling habit. Give it room to spread outward, and it will reward you within a matter of weeks. If your Alyssum starts to look a little tired or leggy partway through summer, a light trim with garden shears will often encourage a fresh flush of blooms and keep that dense coverage going strong for the rest of the season. Common mistake to avoid. One common mistake gardeners make is planting it in deep shade, where it tends to grow leggy and sparse rather than forming that thick, weed-smothering mat we're after. Give it plenty of light and it will stay compact and full. Another mistake is spacing the seedlings too far apart out of a desire to save money on starts, which only slows down that weed-blocking coverage and gives weeds an early head start in the gaps. Now that we've covered a low grower for open sunny beds, let's talk about a plant that's especially good for covering ground in spots where grass struggles, or where you want something that spreads with real enthusiasm and a bit of shimmer. That's Creeping Jenny. Plant 3. Creeping Jenny. Our third plant is Creeping Jenny. Why gardeners love it. Creeping Jenny is a favorite among gardeners who want fast, reliable ground cover, particularly in areas that stay a bit moist or shaded for part of the day. Its trailing stems are lined with small, rounded, bright chartreuse to green leaves that create a striking carpet-like effect wherever it grows. It has a cheerful, almost glowing appearance in the garden, especially when the light catches those golden green leaves in the late afternoon. How it naturally suppresses weeds. This plant suppresses weeds through sheer coverage, combined with a clever growth habit. Creeping Jenny spreads by rooting along its stems as it grows, forming a dense mat that leaves very little open soil exposed to the sun. Because it roots as it spreads, it doesn't just sit on top of the ground the way some ground covers do. It actually knits itself into the soil surface, making it much harder for weed seeds to find a way in, or for existing weed roots to compete for space. It's particularly useful for filling gaps between stepping stones, cascading over the edges of raised beds and retaining walls, or covering slopes where soil might otherwise wash out and expose bare, weed-prone patches after heavy rain. Best growing conditions. Creeping Jenny thrives in partial shade to full sun, and it prefers soil that stays consistently moist, though it can tolerate some dryness once it's fully established. In hotter climates, a bit of afternoon shade will help keep the foliage looking its best and prevent any scorching on particularly intense summer days. Benefits beyond weed control. Beyond weed suppression, it's excellent for erosion control on slopes and embankments, adds vibrant color contrast next to darker foliage plants like heuchera or dark-leaved coral bells, and works beautifully in container gardens where it can trail gracefully over the sides alongside other plants. Practical planting tip. Plant it near the front of a bed or along a border where its spreading habit can be appreciated and where it has room to trail without smothering smaller neighboring plants that might not be able to compete with its vigor. If you're using it as a ground cover between stepping stones, giving it a light trim along the stone edges every few weeks will keep the pathway looking tidy and intentional rather than overgrown. Common mistake to avoid. One common mistake is underestimating just how enthusiastically Creeping Jenny spreads. In consistently moist, favorable conditions, it can grow more assertively than expected, sometimes moving well beyond its intended area within a single growing season. So it's worth checking on it periodically and trimming it back if it starts moving into areas you'd rather keep open, such as a lawn edge or a neighboring garden bed dedicated to something else. A second mistake is planting it near very small, delicate plants without giving those plants a head start, since Creeping Jenny can outcompete slower growers if it's allowed to establish first. Now, before we move on to our fourth plant, I'd love to know, which of these plants do you already grow in your garden? Let me know in the comments below. It's always interesting to hear what's working well for people in different climates, soil types, and growing zones, and I do read through the comments, so feel free to share what's worked in your own yard. While you're thinking about that, if you're finding this useful so far, this is a good moment to hit like and subscribe to Harvest Smarter. That's really the whole idea behind this channel. When you make smart choices like these in the garden, you spend less time fighting problems and get more out of the space you've already got, which means you harvest smarter with less effort. A quick share with a friend or neighbor who's tired of pulling weeds helps this channel reach more gardeners dealing with the same thing. Alright, let's keep going with the next plant. Plant 4, mint. Alright, let's talk about mint. Why gardeners love it. Mint has a bit of a reputation among gardeners, and we'll get into that shortly. But there's a reason it's stayed a garden favorite for generations despite the warnings that usually come attached to it. Gardeners love mint for its refreshing scent, its usefulness in the kitchen for teas, garnishes, and cooking, and honestly, for how effortlessly it grows almost anywhere you put it, even in spots where other plants tend to struggle. How it naturally suppresses weeds. Mint suppresses weeds primarily through its vigorous spreading root system, combined with its dense leafy growth above ground. It spreads by underground runners called rhizomes, which allow it to fill in space both above and below the soil surface remarkably quickly, often faster than gardeners expect. This dense network of roots and thick foliage leaves little room for weeds to establish themselves, since mint is essentially competing for and claiming that space before weeds ever get the chance to sprout. Best growing conditions. Mint grows well in partial shade to full sun and prefers soil that retains some moisture, though it's remarkably adaptable to a wide range of conditions, which is part of why it has such a reputation for taking over. Benefits beyond weed control. Beyond its weed-suppressing qualities, mint offers endless culinary uses, from fresh tea to garnishing summer drinks and desserts. a pleasant fragrance when brushed against while walking through the garden, and it can even help deter certain pests, like ants and aphids, from nearby plants. It's a wonderfully practical plant to have on hand, and having a steady supply just steps from your kitchen door is a nice little luxury. Practical planting tip. Here's an important one, and it's really the key to growing mint successfully without regretting it later. Plant it in a container, even if that container is buried in the ground alongside your other plants. This contains those spreading rhizomes and lets you enjoy mint's weed-suppressing density and culinary usefulness without it wandering into every corner of your garden. If you do bury a container, leave the rim an inch or two above the soil line, since mint can sometimes send runners up and over the edge of a buried pot if the rim sits flush with the ground. Another practical tip is to divide your mint every couple of years. Even in a contained space, mint can become root-bound and a bit tired-looking, and dividing it keeps the plant vigorous and the foliage lush, which in turn keeps that weed-suppressing density working in your favor. Common mistake to avoid. The common mistake, as you might guess, is planting it directly in open garden soil without any kind of barrier. It can spread far more assertively than gardeners expect, sometimes overtaking nearby plants within a single season and becoming genuinely difficult to remove once it's established. So containment really is worth the extra step, even if it feels like an unnecessary precaution at planting time. A second related mistake is choosing a container that's too shallow, since determined mint roots can sometimes find their way out through drainage holes or over a low rim if given the chance. Now let's shift towards something with a bit more height and color. A plant that many gardeners already have in their yards for its beauty, and it turns out it's a hard-working weed suppressor too, once it has a season or two to settle in. Let's talk about daylilies. Plant 5. Daylilies. Our fifth plant is daylilies. Why gardeners love it? Daylilies are beloved for their cheerful, trumpet-shaped blooms that come in shades of yellow, orange, red, pink, and even deep burgundy, often blooming in cycles throughout the summer so that a single clump can offer weeks of color rather than just a brief burst. They're a classic garden choice for a reason. They're dependable. They come back reliably year after year with almost no fuss, and they ask very little of the gardener in return for weeks of consistent, cheerful color. How it naturally suppresses weeds, the way daylilies help with weeds, comes down to their thick, clumping growth habit. Each plant sends up a dense cluster of long, arching, strap-like leaves that grow closely together, forming a solid mass at the base of the plant. As daylilies mature and spread into fuller clumps over a couple of growing seasons, they shade out the soil beneath them almost completely, leaving very little light or space for weeds to establish themselves nearby. This is part of why established daylily beds tend to need so little weeding compared to beds of more sparsely growing perennials. Best growing conditions: daylilies are wonderfully adaptable, growing well in full sun to partial shade, and they tolerate a wide range of soil types, including soil that many other plants would genuinely struggle in, from heavier clay to leaner, sandier ground. Benefits beyond weed control. Beyond weed suppression, they're extremely low maintenance, drought-tolerant once established, resistant to most pests and diseases, and their long bloom season means consistent color in your garden borders for much of the summer, without requiring deadheading, although deadheading spent blooms does keep the bed looking especially tidy if you enjoy that extra bit of upkeep. Practical planting tip. Plant daylilies in groups rather than as single specimens scattered around the yard. Clustering them together in odd-numbered groups, like 3 or 5 plants, speeds up that dense weed-blocking coverage and creates a fuller, more impactful visual display as well, since the blooms tend to look more striking en masse than they do as isolated plants. Another tip worth mentioning is to divide your daylily clumps every 3 to 5 years. Not only does this keep them blooming vigorously, it also gives you free plants to fill in other bare spots around your yard where you'd like that same weed-suppressing coverage. If you're just starting out with daylilies, it's also worth knowing that there are thousands of named varieties out there, ranging from compact, small-flowered types perfect for the front of a border to tall, dramatic varieties that can anchor the back of a bed. For weed suppression specifically, look for varieties described as vigorous or clump-forming, since these tend to fill in more thickly and more quickly than some of the more delicate, slower-spreading hybrids that are bred primarily for unusual bloom colors rather than garden performance. Common mistake to avoid. A common mistake is spacing them too far apart, which leaves gaps of open soil between plants where weeds can easily sneak in during the year or two it takes for the clumps to fill out and meet each other. A second mistake is neglecting to divide overcrowded clumps after several years, since an old, congested clump can sometimes bloom less vigorously and develop a few bare patches at its center, which slightly reduces its weed-blocking coverage right at the point where you'd want it working hardest. From here, let's move into the shade garden, because not every part of your yard gets full sun, and you still need dependable, attractive options there. That brings us to hostas. Plant 6. Hostas. Our sixth plant is hostas. Why gardeners love it? Hostas are practically synonymous with shade gardening, and gardeners love them for their bold, broad leaves that come in an impressive range of colors, from deep blue-green to bright chartreuse, often with attractive white or cream variegation running along the edges. They bring texture and visual interest to areas of the garden that might otherwise feel a bit plain, dark, or difficult to fill with flowering plants that simply won't perform without more sun. How it naturally suppresses weeds. Hostas suppress weeds primarily through their large, overlapping leaves, which form a dense canopy close to the ground once the plant matures. This canopy blocks sunlight so effectively that very little manages to reach the soil underneath, which makes it genuinely difficult for weed seeds to germinate and grow in the space directly around and beneath the plant. As hostas mature into fuller clumps over a few seasons, this shading effect becomes even more pronounced, and a well-established hosta bed often needs surprisingly little weeding compared to a bed of more open, airy plants. Best growing conditions. Hostas thrive in partial to full shade and prefer soil that's rich in organic matter and stays evenly moist without becoming waterlogged, so working some compost into the soil before planting will help them settle in and fill out more quickly. Benefits beyond weed control. Beyond weed control, they're wonderfully low maintenance once established. They return reliably each spring, often larger than the year before, and their lush foliage pairs beautifully with flowering shade companions like astilbe, bleeding heart, or coral bells for a layered, textured look that keeps a shady bed from feeling flat or one-dimensional. Practical planting tip. Choose larger-leaved hosta varieties if weed suppression is your main goal, since more leaf coverage naturally means more shade cast on the soil below. Varieties with a more upright, vase-like habit tend to leave a bit more open soil at their base, so if weed control is your priority, look for varieties described as having a mounding or spreading habit instead. Another helpful tip is to mulch around new hosta plantings for their first year or two, which helps suppress weeds while the hostas themselves are still filling in and haven't yet reached their full weed-blocking size. Common mistake to avoid. A common mistake to avoid is planting hostas in deep, dry shade under trees with thirsty, competing roots, where they'll struggle to get the moisture they need and won't fill in as densely, which in turn reduces their weed-blocking effectiveness right when you need it most. A second common mistake is placing hostas somewhere with too much direct afternoon sun, particularly for thinner-leaved varieties, which can lead to scorched, crispy leaf edges that thin out the canopy and leave gaps for weeds to sneak through. For our final plant today, let's stay in the shade a little longer and talk about a plant that brings a soft, graceful texture to those cooler, greener corners of the garden. Let's talk about ferns. Plant 7. Ferns. Our seventh and final plant is ferns. Why gardeners love it. Ferns have a timeless, almost woodland quality that gardeners love, especially in shaded beds where color options can feel a bit limited. Their delicate feathery fronds add a lovely softness and gentle movement to the garden, swaying nicely in even a light breeze, and they pair beautifully with hostas, heucheras, and other shade-loving companions we've already talked about today, rounding out that layered, natural look many gardeners aim for in a woodland-style bed. How it naturally suppresses weeds. Ferns suppress weeds through a combination of their dense clustering of fronds and their spreading root systems below the surface. As they establish and multiply over a few seasons, many fern varieties form thick colonies that cover the soil surface extensively, leaving little open ground exposed to sunlight. That combination of shade cast from the fronds above and root competition happening below makes it genuinely difficult for weeds to get established once ferns have filled in an area properly. Best growing conditions: ferns generally prefer partial to full shade and thrive in soil that's consistently moist and rich in organic matter, similar to the conditions you'd find naturally on a forest floor beneath a canopy of trees. Benefits beyond weed control. Beyond suppressing weeds, ferns add texture and softness that balances out bolder, broader foliage plants nearby. They require very little maintenance once settled in, and many varieties are quite long-lived, coming back reliably year after year and often spreading gently to fill in even more space over time, which only improves their weed-blocking ability as the seasons pass. Practical planting tip: mulch around newly planted ferns with something like shredded bark or leaf mold, which helps retain the moisture they love while they're becoming established and filling in during that first year or two. Leaf mold in particular tends to mimic the natural forest floor conditions ferns are adapted to, so if you have access to composted leaves, that's often an excellent choice. Another tip is to be patient during the first season, since ferns often spend their early months focused on establishing roots below ground before you see much new growth above it. So don't be discouraged if progress feels slow at first. Common mistake to avoid. A common mistake is planting ferns in a spot that dries out too quickly, such as under the eaves of a house or in compacted soil near a foundation, since consistently dry conditions will slow their growth considerably and reduce how well they fill in and suppress weeds around them. A second mistake is placing them somewhere with too much direct sun, which can scorch the delicate fronds and leave the planting looking thin and stressed rather than lush and full, undermining the very coverage you're hoping to achieve. Conclusion: so there you have it. 7 dependable, easy-to-grow plants that can help you naturally reduce weed growth while making your garden more beautiful and enjoyable along the way. Lavender and sweet alyssum work wonderfully in sunny beds and borders, bringing fragrance and color while filling in bare soil quickly. Creeping Jenny is fantastic for ground cover, slopes, and those tricky spots between pavers or stones. Mint, when kept thoughtfully contained, is a practical and fragrant addition that earns its keep in the kitchen as well as the garden. Daylilies bring reliable, cheerful color and thick coverage to sunny to partly shaded areas with almost no fuss. And hostas and ferns are perfect partners for those shadier corners of your yard that need a little more life, texture, and interest without demanding much from you in return. The main idea to take away from today is simple, but it's worth repeating. Choosing the right plants for the right spots in your garden can naturally reduce weed growth while creating a healthier, more attractive landscape overall, all without relying on chemical weed killers or spending every weekend pulling weeds by hand instead of actually enjoying your garden. If you're feeling inspired but a little overwhelmed by the idea of adding 7 new plants at once, my honest advice, as someone who has made that mistake myself, is to start small. Pick 1 or 2 plants from this list that suit the light and soil conditions you already have, and give them a season or two to settle in and show you what they can do in your particular yard. You can always add more from this list later once you see how they perform for you, and once you've built up a bit of confidence and experience with each one. Gardening really does reward patience far more than it rewards trying to do everything at once, and a garden that grows gradually, plant by plant, tends to feel more thoughtful and more truly yours in the end. I'd also gently encourage you to pay attention to your own yard's particular conditions, rather than trying to force a plant to work somewhere it clearly isn't suited to. A plant that struggles in the wrong spot won't fill in well, and a thin, struggling planting won't suppress weeds nearly as effectively as a healthy, thriving one will. So take a little time to observe how much sun different parts of your garden actually receive throughout the day, how quickly water drains after a good rain, and what's already growing well nearby, and let that guide which of these 7 plants you try first. One last thought before we wrap up. Timing matters too. Many of these plants, particularly the perennials like daylilies, hostas, and ferns, establish best when planted in spring or early fall, giving their roots a chance to settle in before the stress of summer heat or winter cold arrives. If you're eager to get started, take a look at your local planting calendar for your particular growing zone and aim to get these into the ground during one of those more forgiving windows. A little patience with timing now can mean a much stronger, faster-filling planting later, which of course means better weed suppression sooner rather than later. Thank you for spending a little time with me today. I hope these ideas inspire you to enjoy gardening a little more each season, and I hope your garden feels a little easier to care for from here on out. If you found this video helpful, please take a moment to like it, drop a comment, and share it with a fellow gardener who could use these tips. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Harvest Smarter for more practical, natural ways to get more out of your garden with less effort along the way. Until next time, take care and happy gardening.